Great. So I wanted to go into some more this morning about wisdom. So I'd promised this topic of wisdom, whole program called Digital Wisdom.
Hmm.
Promised an explanation of what wisdom is and what it means and how it might differ from other states of mind. But so the brief version, and so giving the context, though, I'd mentioned that all of the different trainings that I've learned, and in general, all of the different trainings that transform our emotional body, our emotional mind, can be grouped into these six: giving, moral discipline, patience, effort, concentration, and then wisdom. This final one, wisdom. They're taught in that order because there is some foundation that's built up. I mean, giving is the simplest among them. If your dog is holding on to something, won't let it go, you just come on, give it up. It's a relaxing of this grasping, a relaxing of this craving and tension, and just having a different mind that, in fact, is the opposite of that, wanting others to benefit and have something instead of having everything for ourselves, and so on. Each of these minds builds upon the other. Concentration is in particular a foundation for wisdom because concentration means a mind that is still and peaceful, deeply still and deeply peaceful. And as your mind is still and peaceful, then it's easier for you to understand and perceive things that otherwise your mind might have been a bit too distracted to perceive. So distraction interferes with our ability to discern subtle truths, subtle points, and wisdom is a subtle point. There's some subtlety to wisdom. The definition of wisdom is a virtuous, intelligent mind that functions to thoroughly understand its object. That's the definition I was taught. Um, the characteristic of wisdom is that it is intelligent, but it is a virtuous, intelligent mind. It's not intelligence used to find the best way to, harm others. It's intelligence used for benevolent purposes, beneficial purposes, to create value, so to speak, rather than destroying value. So a virtuous, intelligent mind that functions to thoroughly understand the nature of its object. So this is an idea of digging beneath the surface to gain a thorough understanding. And there are two kinds of wisdom, and I'd mentioned this, I think, briefly before, perhaps though it was just on Tuesday. Two kinds of wisdom. One is the wisdom understanding the power of our actions. And this is something I've been touching on a lot, that every time we engage in an action, we reinforce these habits deep in our mind, reinforce these patterns, make them more automatic. And in fact, we gradually change our world by the actions that we do. That's what's called wisdom understanding actions. But the other kind of wisdom is called wisdom understanding emptiness. And this is a wisdom of unlearning rather than a wisdom of creating a new and better world in our perception. It is the wisdom of unlearning and looking beneath the surface. So I'll start by guiding us through a practice of this wisdom of emptiness, a very practical way to practice this. And then I'll give some more explanations. I'll guide us in meditation through how we can actually meditate on this wisdom of emptiness. Emptiness, just to say in this context, is a bit like if you see something but think it's real, but then you see through it and you realize, oh, it's just empty, just like an illusion, just like a bubble of water or something like that. You realize you can kind of see through things, see through the way we perceive things, and there's a kind of unlearning there. Instead of just assenting to our habitual perceptions of things, we see deeper. All right. So as usual, we can begin just by taking a deep breath in and out. Making sure our body is still and comfortable. And then another deep breath and just inviting ourselves to relax. And then a third breath, and we can just ask ourselves, what is important right now? And we can stay focused on our breathing for a little bit to begin to settle our mind down. Our breathing proceeds slowly, but sustains our life. Every breath is a layer of our life. And we can bring our attention to our breath just to help us to settle our mind, to prevent our mind from shooting around so rapidly, and also to begin to develop some deeper appreciation for this quiet movement of life inside of us. Then as our mind begins to settle down a bit, we can just try to notice any small increase in our inner peace, any feeling of greater peace. We just hold that for a moment. And then we can, to meditate on emptiness, we can begin by just noticing what's on our mind. What problem, challenge are we worrying about in our life? What do we wake up thinking about? What's preoccupying us now? It can be anything, but it is likely some problem we're dealing with. We try to get some feeling for this problem that we're dealing with. And we can try to simplify it, maybe boiling it down to just one or two words that describe that problem. But then we can ask ourselves, how is it that we see ourselves in this situation? This problem is implying something about ourselves, something that we can't do or shouldn't be, or something perhaps about ourselves. How do we see ourselves in the midst of this problem? If there was something different about us, this problem might not exist. So what is that? Just try to notice the way we see ourselves in the midst of this particular problem. We try to boil that down to just a word or two. Maybe we feel incapable or overwhelmed or guilty or afraid or whatever it is. You just ask yourself, how is it that we see ourselves in the midst of this problem? And then we just ask ourselves, is that really true? Is that true about us, that belief we have of ourselves? For example, would everyone agree with that? Would everyone say that that's true about us? Are we always that way? And if we are not sure, if we think maybe we are always that way, we can dig a little bit deeper and we just ask ourselves, what part of us is like that? Is it something physical? Is it something mental? If we're feeling incapable, what specifically does that mean, that we are incapable? we try to nail that down to something very small, very specific. And in this way, then we ask ourselves, is this really the truth? Thinking back to how the limited version of ourself that we saw, is that really the truth? What if that was not the truth? What if we weren't qualified to know what was true about ourselves? Could we imagine dropping that version of ourself, that self that is overwhelmed or incapable or guilty or whatever? Imagine just dropping that version of ourself and focus on that feeling. What would happen to the problem around us if that version of ourself didn't exist? And we try to get some sense if that person who was at the heart of our problem, if that person doesn't exist, what happens to that problem? And this is the emptiness of ourself. This is the emptiness of that version of ourself. And the emptiness of that problem. We try to get some feeling for this. If that self doesn't exist, how can the problem exist? And from this state of emptiness, then we can think, what would I like to be instead? What is an alternative version of myself that I could be to better meet this challenge? We hold this alternative view of ourself that can comfortably meet the challenge that we're facing. And just hold that in our mind. And then we can conclude by developing the intention that through this time here, we may strengthen these habits of mind, being able to learn how to unlearn our normal perceptions, learn how to unlearn our ordinary perceptions, and to create a more useful conceptions, perceptions. We develop this intention for our time here. And then we can open our eyes and arise from our meditation. So, and I'd like to invite you, sometimes this meditation can raise some questions or uncertainty about how it works, or did it work, or what we were doing and so forth. So I'd like to invite anybody, if you had questions about that, and I can go back through and explain, but while it's fresh in your mind, if anybody wanted to share experience or ask questions, then happy to. That might open up questions and uncertainties for others as well. But
Andrea, as I was going through the meditation, it seemed to me that some of the suggestions you were making were aimed at a person who was feeling bad about themselves or questioning their judgments. Whereas the problem that I'm having is I'm too sure I'm right about things. And, being too willing to convey that information to other people.
Mm-hmm.
So how should I adjust my meditation for that?
That's a great question. So we think about the situation, which is we're too sure we're right, and that probably is creating some resentful responses from the people around us. But then we ask the same question: who is that person in the midst of it all, and what are they like? How would we identify their characteristics? And maybe it's just right. That person is right. That person is clear. That person knows the truth. That's one version. You can also meditate on them, right? And you can think, how do we perceive them in this situation? And that might also be helpful. So maybe we see them as being clueless. And if we see the other person as being clueless, then we think, okay, are they really clueless? Would everyone think that they're clueless? Are there any exceptions to them being clueless? Do they think they're clueless? And just beginning to develop a little bit of doubt initially in our own perception. And then if we focus on ourselves, we think, am I always right? Am I always clear? Do my ideas always work out? These are ways of developing some doubts. Basically, and when we develop a doubt about our own perception, then our reality shakes a little bit. And then if we deepen that doubt and we pull that doubt apart and we think, okay, let's say this person isn't clueless. If this person wasn't clueless, would this situation, what would happen to the situation? If I was dealing with somebody who wasn't clueless, then the whole issue with me trying to force or push my point of view on them would go away, right? And so the problem dissolves when you change how you see the other person. The problem dissolves when you change how you see yourself, either of these things. And at that point, what you've done is you've unlearned that view of yourself, at least for a moment, or you unlearn that view of the other person, at least for a moment. And, unlearning, there's this momentary unlearning, but then there's just stabilizing that unlearning. It's like somebody explains some complex math and you get it, and then you forget it moments later, right? So we need to stabilize our understanding. So we need to stabilize these by spending some time with it. And that's what we do in meditation. We think, okay, I am not surrounded by clueless people. And we just meditate on that. And that's a meditation. The people around me see things clearly in their own way. Maybe not always, but, and then we just think, what's the feeling that arises from that? And maybe the feeling is humility in that case, or whatever is the feeling that arises. And you can use that feeling to anchor your meditation. And the meditation, then, if you can really enjoy that. You can think, I'm surrounded by competent people. That's amazing. I had no idea. And yeah, Eileen.
I was wondering, I guess I got hung up on the idea or the question of whether wisdom should be shared. Is wisdom something you reach in yourself as a level of confidence about a situation and you can focus on that or meditate on that? Or do you feel there's an obligation with wisdom to share? We always talk about the wisdom of our elders or the wisdom of helping other people, because you see with the situation, is there this sharing ultimately, is that part of when you get to that feeling of wisdom that you are either deciding or choosing to share it or not to share it? Is there an obligation, or should you just meditate on that?
No, it's great. And there's a time and place for sharing your wisdom with other people. Because people don't always get it. People are sometimes clueless, or at least it's worth being open to the possibility. And that's kind of where it wraps around, and the idea of giving wisdom, like giving wisdom, giving wise advice, can be the most useful kind of giving, right? So I'm not, it may be right for Jill to be trying to. Jill may be right or closer to right than the people she's communicating with. But then there's also this other question where maybe the wisdom is knowing how to help them be receptive to it, right? Because that's the challenge. If they don't want that wisdom, they're not receptive to it, then it's counterproductive for us to share. And so there's I'm the guy who set up this class called Digital Wisdom. So I'm obviously a little bit biased in the direction of trying to share wisdom, but there's a traditional Buddhist practice where you don't give teachings unless you've been requested 3 times. Oh. You have to actually be requested 3 times, and then, all right, okay, I'll explain. So, you don't always find people. Most people don't know they're supposed to go through this formal ritual of requesting 3 times. But it speaks to how there is an interdependence. Yes, you might have wisdom, but other people need to be in a mental space to be able to receive that wisdom. And that's our wisdom. That's wisdom of knowing how we can help others to be receptive. Yeah. And there's a skill there, and no perfect answers, but, sometimes it's the most, and, if you're as a group trying to solve a problem and you can gain some insight that other people didn't have, sometimes if you share that insight, other people can understand it right away, and it can be the most useful thing ever. So it varies, but we need to understand that there's factors beyond just our wisdom. It's the receptivity. Other questions, thoughts? So these two wisdoms that I mentioned at the beginning, the wisdom of our actions and the wisdom of emptiness, the wisdom of unlearning, they go together in the sense that whether we know it or not, our perception of the world is built up through our own actions and mental activity. Now, a lot of our perception of the world is instinctive. We've inherited it just because we're human, right? There's certain things we instinctively recognize, the pain of fire and so forth. But much of our perception is layered on through our conceptions of things, right? We develop, and our actions kind of reinforce our conceptions of things. So thinking about we normally don't doubt our own perceptions, and that's the underlying challenge that this wisdom of emptiness is trying to get at. We normally just assume that we're seeing the truth, and that's everyone, and that's why we are not normally more receptive to others' wisdom. We should always start there. How can we be receptive to the wisdom of others? And then if you've really trained in being deeply receptive to the wisdom of others, then it puts you in a much better position to offer your wisdom, because in a sense, maybe you're just passing it along. But there's some wisdoms that you can convey through words, but there's some wisdoms that you can really only gain through your own experience. And a lot of this is, just think about the way I guided the meditation. We begin by thinking about a problem that we have. And I asked you to, okay, what's on your mind? And what's on our mind normally is tied to some problem, right? Because our mind's always on solving these problems. Like, we're always trying to solve these problems. And because we're always trying to solve some problem, we always think we need to take an action. That's normally what we do. We take an action. But what happens is every time we take an action, there's always an implicit we there, right? I'm going to say this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go there. But we rarely, if ever, question, who is this we? Who is this person we think we are? But that person is the central conception in our mind. We have conceptions about other people and conceptions about the world and conceptions about all these kinds of things, but the central conception is who we think we are. And that implicit in that simple word I are the implicit beliefs behind billions of past actions. Everything we've done throughout our whole life has always had this sense of who we are, who the world is, and so forth. And at the most basic level, we have this sense that we are independent of the world, that there is this separation between ourselves and this world. But in fact, there is an interdependence between the speaker and the listener, right? That we're all different. I'm different now because of you being here to listen. You're different because of my being here to speak, and so forth. So that the version of ourself that's arising right now is the version of me, for example, as a teacher, and you, for example, as a listener. But that's just a version of ourself, but it's interdependent. You can't really separate. If you know this old koan, what's the sound of one hand clapping, right? You take away either of the hands, and what's left? What are you as a listener or learner if you take away the teacher, right? Or what's the teacher if you take away the listeners? The whole thing disappears. What's this problem if we take away the version of ourself that is, involved in that problem, either too confident or not confident enough, or all of these things are interdependent, and the world that we're operating in, it's a world of systems, um, and that everything. So the world that we're operating in is a world of systems, but and those systems are infinitely complex. You can't actually draw a boundary between any two things, like these lakes in Eileen's, Wisconsin here, or sorry, Michigan, sorry, here. What's the real boundary between one lake and another, right? If they're connected through these little rivers, the water actually is underneath the ground. Where's the real boundary between these 7 seas or 5 oceans? There's no real boundaries, but our mind creates these conceptual boundaries, and many of them are instinctive, that we as human animals create, but we also create these distinctions, cities, states, where's the boundary between this city and the next city? Where can you actually draw that line? So when you look at the boundaries of things, that clarity begins to break down. And you begin to realize that all of the clarity that we have, all of these clear conceptions, they're just created by the mind. So like, you think that things are solid, like you're walking along a sidewalk, right? You think it's a solid sidewalk, but it's actually just a collection of these tiny grains of sand that go into concrete, right? You wash away a little bit of grain of sand, a little bit of grain of sand after years and decades and so forth, centuries, the whole thing just disappears. But because when we see it, we forget that it was actually created from sand originally. It took sand, created concrete, poured the sidewalk. But our minds forget how things were created. And that also goes for ourself, and it goes for the world that we're around. And we get ourselves into these situations that feel very real, right? Like we're surrounded by a situation that's impossible to deal with. Or we're surrounded by incapable people or something like this. We get ourselves in these situations that are real, and then we try to take actions to solve the situation, but we rarely question the underlying beliefs that are beneath those actions, that are beneath our perception of that situation. So are we really incapable? Do we really need to do something here? Are these other people really incapable? And so we begin to develop some doubt, and there's countless ways to develop some doubt, but one way or another, when we drop our normal conceptions of ourself or others or that situation, that's called seeing the emptiness of that self, or the emptiness of other people, or the emptiness of the situation. So it's where it seemed like there was something solid and real there, and then you push through it, and actually, there are no incapable people, or there is no me who is overwhelmed, or there is no on a profound level, it gets quite surreal. You say there is no sidewalk, right? Now, that sounds crazy, like crazy talk, right? Or people sometimes talk about, according to quantum physics, whatever else, it's all empty space. And it sounds a little bit lofty, but the point is, when you know how things have been created over time, you know that they could be recreated. And you think about your workplace, right? Where you work, the power relationships that have been set up, the interactions between people, what's important. All of these things have been built up over time in our society. The way our society's been built up is based on layers of beliefs and activities and so forth, but all of it is subject to change. And now what we're seeing really is so much of our world is changing rapidly. The natural environment is being, overrun by humans, even things that seemed infinite, like the oceans and so forth, getting filled with plastics and so forth. None of these things are infinite, but also the power structures within our society, they're changing rapidly because none of them are actually real or solid. They've just been built up from layers and layers and layers of actions and beliefs and the physical things that we surround to make these things real. But I'm kind of getting a little bit too far out, but on a very practical, personal level, we just think, who is this person that I think I am? All of my headaches, all of my problems, all of your worries, all of your disappointments, they're all based on this one central character, who you think you are. Right? And what if you were wrong? What if that wasn't who you were? What if that wasn't who you were? Then what would happen to all of those problems, right? And that's meditating on the emptiness of yourself and just allowing yourself to unlearn that version of yourself. And maybe at first you just get a flicker, right? Well, maybe I'm not the one that I was thinking about. I'm bad at planning. That was the one that came up for me. I'm bad at planning, right? Maybe I'm not. What if I'm not bad at planning? I made a lot of plans in my life, right? I've carried through on a lot of things. What if that person didn't exist? How would things be different? So it's not to say it's easy to make changes, to change from being, because these habits are very deep. Habits of not planning, for example, or responding to whatever are the immediate circumstances, or immediately telling people what we think and so forth. These habits can be very deep, but at the same time, it just knowing that it's not actually a final truth or a real truth allows us to open up the possibility. What if I was somebody different? What if we could create a different version of ourselves? Not strictly in the realm of fantasy, but something that can move us, a vision of ourselves that is different, that draws out of us more capability than we realized we had. More skill, for example, in interacting with others, more confidence in our own capabilities, etc. We can draw that out if we first unlearn through realizing and recognizing the emptiness of ourself. It opens up the possibility for us to recreate a version of ourselves that is more useful for the circumstances we find ourselves in now. So that's that is a deeper, profound kind of wisdom. The wisdom of actions, understanding how habits are built up gradually. The wisdom of emptiness, understanding how we can deconstruct the self that we think we are and the world that we think we live in. So we can take just a minute here at the end to settle back into meditation and to develop some intention to conclude our time here together. So again, just taking a deep breath in and out to settle our mind again. And we can simply recognize that the world that we normally see has been built up through our own instinctive tendencies, as well as the tendencies that we have accumulated over our life. We've come to see ourselves and our world in a particular way. And that way that we see ourselves and our world is at the root of all of the problems that we experience. In emptiness, there are no problems. And then we can develop an intention how wonderful it would be if I could readily unlearn these patterns of thought, conception, help others to unlearn their patterns of thought and conception that bind us. And then with this intention, we can open our eyes and arise from our meditation. All right, so thank you very much, everybody.